When a case stays in the public eye for more than 20 years, people naturally assume every question has already been answered. That is exactly what happened with the Laci Peterson case. Most believe the story was finished and the truth had already been uncovered. However, new developments in 2026 have reopened one of America's most talked-about criminal cases, revealing information that has shocked even those who followed it from the very beginning. A quiet life of a young couple in Modesto. Laci Peterson was 27 years old and 8 months pregnant with her first child when the winter of 2002 settled over Modesto, California. She and her husband Scott had built what looked like an ordinary and hopeful life together in a modest home on Covina Avenue. Friends and family described Laci as warm and full of plans for the baby boy they had already named Connor. Scott worked as a fertilizer salesman, and the couple seemed to move through the days of late pregnancy with a mix of excitement and ordinary routine that marks so many young families. On the morning of December 24th, Scott later told police he left the house around 9:30 or 10 o'clock to drive alone to the Berkeley Marina and go fishing in San Francisco Bay near Brooks Island. When he returned home that afternoon, Laci was gone, and their golden retriever Mackenzie was found wandering outside with the leash still attached. Within hours, the disappearance became a national story. Television cameras filled the quiet streets, and cable news turned every small development into nightly drama that held millions of people in its grip. Scott's affair with massage therapist Amber Fry surfaced almost immediately. He had told her he was a widower spending his first holiday season alone. The revelation transformed public perception overnight. A husband who had been cheating while his pregnant wife vanished looked guilty to people watching from their living rooms, and the investigation itself seemed to move in step with that growing judgment. Prosecutors eventually built their theory around the image of a man who killed his wife inside the house, transported her body to the marina, and dumped her from his newly purchased 14-foot boat so that the remains would disappear into the bay. No blood, tissue, or DNA consistent with a violent homicide was ever found inside the home, the truck, or the boat. The only physical link to Laci on the boat was 2 strands of hair recovered from under a seat. Concrete anchors Scott had mixed became central to the prosecution story, even though the jury never saw clear proof that those anchors had been attached to a body. The media coverage grew so intense that once the nation decided Scott was the only possible suspect, every other possibility began to fade from official attention, and the official narrative hardened around a single theory that would shape the next 22 years. Yet even as that narrative took hold, a different set of voices was already trying to be heard. The neighbors who said they saw her walking. In the first days after Laci vanished, more than a dozen ordinary people called police and the tip line to report that they had seen a pregnant woman walking a golden retriever in East La Loma Park or along the neighborhood streets on the morning of December 24th. Several of those sightings occurred after the time Scott said he had already left for the marina. Witnesses, including Tony Freitas, Martha Aguilar, Gene Pedrioli, and John Brazil, described a woman with short dark hair who matched Laci's appearance and who appeared to be having trouble controlling the dog. The accounts shared common details about location, timing, and the dog's behavior that made the cluster of reports harder to dismiss as simple mistakes or wishful thinking. A mail carrier who delivered to the Peterson home between 10:35 and 10:55 that morning later recalled that the gate stood open and the dog that usually barked was silent. That observation fit the larger pattern of the other reports. Detective Nanette Tuzby has said that a missing person investigation requires every lead of this kind to be exhausted, because even one credible sighting after the husband left the house would have removed him as a suspect within 48 hours. Instead, the reports were set aside. Police never systematically walked the witnesses back to the exact locations or treated the cluster of accounts as a possible alibi that needed to be eliminated or confirmed through careful follow-up work. None of those witnesses was called to testify at trial in any meaningful way. The possibility that Laci was still alive and walking her dog after Scott drove away simply disappeared from the official narrative that the public and the court would ultimately accept. If you put yourself in the place of those callers, you can sense the quiet frustration that must have followed them for years. They believed they had seen a living pregnant woman in broad daylight, and the official response treated their eyes as unreliable or simply inconvenient. The decision to discount the sightings did more than ignore individual statements. It closed an entire avenue of investigation at the exact moment when the case was still open, and the truth was still reachable if investigators had chosen to pursue it with the same energy they gave to building the case against Scott. While those neighborhood voices were being set aside, another crime was unfolding only steps away from the Peterson front door. The burglary that happened across the street. Directly across Covina Avenue, the Medina family left their house around 10:30 on the morning of December 24th for a short holiday trip to Southern California. When they returned on the afternoon of December 26th, they found their home had been burglarized. A safe, jewelry, guns, and tools were gone. Two men named Stephen Todd and Donald Glenn Pierce were later arrested. Both told police the crime happened on December 26th after Lacey had already been reported missing. Multiple neighbors reported a suspicious van and men at the Medina property on the 24th itself. One account described men carrying a safe. A confidential informant and later jailhouse conversations claimed that Lacey had interrupted the burglary and threatened to call the police. On the morning of December 25th, a stolen van was found fully engulfed in flames roughly 1 mile away behind the home of a relative of Todd. Inside the burned vehicle sat a mattress that tested presumptively positive for blood. A gas can had been placed on top of a portion of the mattress, preserving that area from complete destruction by the fire. Fire investigator Brian Spitulski noted that the fire appeared intentional and designed to erase physical evidence. From the point where the Colorado River Compact promised more water than the river could actually deliver, the crisis became almost inevitable. The agreement signed in 1922 divided 16.5 million acre-feet of water each year among the basin states and Mexico, but those figures were based on an unusually wet period rather than the river's true long-term average. In reality, the Colorado River has delivered far less water, especially since 2000, forcing Lake Mead to make up the difference by steadily draining its stored reserves. Year after year, the reservoir dropped lower, triggering increasingly severe shortage declarations. By 2022, Lake Mead had fallen to its lowest level since it was first filled, exposing abandoned boat ramps, sunken vessels, and even human remains that had been hidden beneath the water for decades. Scientists describe the region's current conditions as a megadrought, the worst in at least 1,200 years, made even worse by rising temperatures that reduce snowpack and increase evaporation. As the lake continues to decline, officials monitor critical thresholds that determine when deeper water cuts take effect and when Hoover Dam begins losing its ability to generate electricity. At 1,035 feet above sea level, most of the dam's turbines can no longer operate, causing hydroelectric production to collapse dramatically. If the water falls to 950 feet, power generation effectively ends, and at 895 feet, the dreaded dead pool level, the reservoir can no longer release water downstream through the dam at all. Although Lake Mead still sits well above dead pool, it has already lost roughly half the distance separating it from that catastrophic level since 2000. Engineers also face another challenge. Hoover Dam's original intake structures were built for a much higher lake level, meaning some have already become ineffective as the water recedes. In 2026, negotiations among the 7 basin states reached another critical moment after years of disagreement. Exceptionally poor Rocky Mountain snowpack and an early heat wave sharply reduced runoff into Lake Powell, forcing federal officials to keep more water behind Glen Canyon Dam to preserve power generation there. As a result, significantly less water flowed into Lake Mead, increasing concerns that Hoover Dam's electricity production could decline even further. Farmers in Arizona have already experienced major irrigation cuts, while California's senior water rights remain protected for now, setting the stage for potentially enormous legal disputes if lake levels continue to fall. Despite repeated negotiations, the basin states have struggled to agree on long-term solutions, leaving the gap between promised water and available water unresolved. The third part was where the real money went, and it is the part that gives this whole story its title. The tunnel under the lake. Las Vegas had 2 intake pipes drawing water from Lake Mead. Both were built when the reservoir was reliably full, engineered for a lake nobody ever expected to fall this far. As the water level dropped through the 2000s, the Water Authority's engineers reached a simple but alarming conclusion. At some point, The existing intakes would rise clean above the water line, left sucking air while the lake retreated below them. So, in 2005, the board approved a third intake. They set aside $812 million for it, and construction began in 2008. The plan was to drill a new intake far deeper than the others from below. Picture the crew who dug it. Nearly 3 kilometers in from the shaft, hundreds of feet down, a handful of men stood inside a bore 24 feet across beneath the floor of an active reservoir. Above their heads was not rock but water, millions of tons of it, pressing down through fault lines that could leak and flood without warning. The boring machine ground forward through hard rock 1 hour, and through saturated, waterlogged ground the next. There was no daylight and no fast way out, and the lake they were working under was the same lake the entire city was fighting to keep. The finished tunnel ran 4.7 kilometers, feeding an intake structure anchored to the very bottom of the reservoir with more than 1,000 truckloads of concrete. Tunneling ran from 2011 to 2014, and the intake structure lowered to the lake floor weighed over 1,200 tons. Among tunneling engineers, this was regarded as one of the most technically demanding projects completed anywhere on Earth that decade. It collected engineering awards from organizations in the United States, Switzerland, and Britain. Intake number 3 began operating in September 2015. It reached far deeper than the old pipes, but there was a catch built into it. It still shared pumping infrastructure with the original intakes, which limited its operation to water levels above 1,000 feet. So the Water Authority went further and built a dedicated pumping station to push past that limit. The low lake level pumping station was completed in 2020 and switched on in April 2022, at the exact moment the falling lake rendered one of the original pumping stations inoperable. It came in under its $650 million budget at $522 million, and it can move up to 900 million gallons a day. Together, the third intake and the new pumping station reach water sitting at 875 feet above sea level. Read that number against the one from earlier. Dead pool is 895 feet. This system reaches water 20 feet below dead pool, which means that if Lake Mead falls to the point where Hoover Dam can no longer release a single drop downstream, where Arizona, California, and Mexico lose their supply entirely, Las Vegas can still draw water from what remains of the lake. The total cost of the intake system came to roughly $1.5 billion. It is the most direct answer any city drawing from Lake Mead has given to the question of what happens when the water just keeps falling. And there was a fourth part, quieter than the rest: underground storage through artificial recharge programs. Southern Nevada has spent years injecting treated water down into local aquifers, banking it for later. Across projects in Nevada, Arizona, California, and inside Lake Mead itself, the Water Authority has stored more than 2.2 million acre-feet, a hidden reserve to draw on when the lake drops fastest or the cuts bite deepest. Las Vegas has done more to prepare for a shrinking lake than any other city that depends on it. The conservation gains are real. The recycling loop works. The third intake. The city that saw it coming. When people picture what is draining Lake Mead, Las Vegas comes to mind first. The Strip, the fountains, the hotels running around the clock, the golf courses carved improbably into the Mojave. A city built on spectacle in the middle of the desert pulling from a shrinking lake. Surely, Las Vegas is a huge part of the problem. The numbers say otherwise. Southern Nevada's entire annual allocation from the Colorado River is just 300,000 acre-feet. Arizona receives 8 times that. California receives 13 times more. And agriculture across the Southwest consumes roughly 70% of all Colorado River water. Las Vegas accounts for a small fraction of what a single farming region uses in a year. On top of that, the city built on excess is one of the most water-efficient large urban systems in North America. And for the past 2 decades, while the state negotiations stalled and the lake kept falling, it has been spending heavily to stay that way. That effort came in 4 parts. The first part was conservation, and it started with grass. Ornamental lawns that nobody walked on required constant irrigation, evaporated water that could never be recovered and existed almost entirely for the way they looked. So, the state started paying people to tear them out. Homeowners received $3 for every square foot of decorative grass they removed, and replaced it with desert landscaping. Since 1999, some 250 million square feet have been pulled up, saving roughly 203 billion gallons of water. The work is nearly finished, and by 2027, all non-functional grass in the city will be banned from using Colorado River water at all. The results are hard to argue with. Between 2002 and 2024, Southern Nevada cut its per capita water use by 55% while adding 829,000 new residents. The metropolitan area grew by nearly 1 million people and still used less total water than it did before those people ever arrived. The second part was recycling. Nearly all of the water Las Vegas uses indoors is treated and returned to Lake Mead. The city receives credit for every gallon it sends back. So indoor use is effectively recycled, not lost. Gross withdrawals from the lake run close to 600,000 acre-feet a year, but net consumption stays right at the 300,000 acre-foot allocation limit. Half of everything the city draws comes straight back. The third part is where the real money went, and it is the part that gives this whole story its title: the tunnel under the lake. Las Vegas had 2 intake pipes drawing water from Lake Mead. Both were built when the reservoir was reliably full, engineered for a lake nobody ever expected to fall this far. As the water level dropped through the 2000s, the Water Authority's engineers reached a simple, alarming conclusion. At some point, the existing intakes would rise clean above the water line, left sucking air while the lake retreated below them. So in 2005, the board approved a third intake. They set aside $812 million for it, and construction began in 2008. The plan was to drill a new intake far deeper than the others from below. Picture the crew who dug it. Nearly 3 kilometers in from the shaft, hundreds of feet down, a handful of men stand inside a bore 24 feet across beneath the floor of an active reservoir. Above their heads is not rock, but water, millions of tons of it, pressing down through fault lines that leak and flood without warning. The boring machine grinds forward through hard rock 1 hour and through saturated waterlogged ground the next. There is no daylight, no fast way out. And the lake they are working under is the same lake the entire city is fighting to keep. The finished tunnel ran 4.7 kilometers, feeding an intake structure anchored to the very bottom of the reservoir with more than 1,000 truckloads of concrete. Tunneling ran from 2011 to 2014. The intake structure lowered to the lake floor weighs over 1,200 tons. Among tunneling engineers, this was regarded as one of the most technically demanding projects completed anywhere on Earth that decade. It collected engineering awards from organizations in the United States, Switzerland, and Britain. Intake number 3 began operating in September 2015. It reached far deeper than the old pipes, but there was a catch built into it. It still shared pumping infrastructure with the original intake.